At the G7 summit in 2026, something happened that has never happened before. The CEOs of the most powerful AI companies on Earth sat in the room with the leaders of the world's 7 largest economies, not as guests, but as principals. One analyst described it plainly, a signal of where power sits. So here's the question you need to sit with. When the people building the most consequential technology in human history get a seat at the table that used to belong exclusively to nation-states, what exactly changes about how you should be thinking about AI regulation, AI risk, and where capital flows next? Let us be precise about what occurred at the G7 summit and resist the temptation to overstate or understate it. Based on what the headlines establish, the leaders of the G7 nations were joined by executives from OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, not briefed by them afterward, not advised by them in a separate room, joined by them. The framing used, a signal of where power sits, is not commentary from a tech blog. That language reflects how participants and observers characterize the dynamic in real time. This is meaningful for a specific structural reason. The G7 has historically been the mechanism through which major economies coordinate on issues too large and too interconnected for any single country to manage alone: trade, sanctions, financial stability. The inclusion of AI laboratory executives in that forum suggests that governments have made a decision, perhaps not yet formalized, but clearly directional. AI development is now a matter of national and geopolitical coordination, not merely domestic technology policy. For investors, and anyone tracking where regulatory risk lives, this distinction matters enormously. A domestic regulatory regime is bounded. It can be litigated, delayed, jurisdictionally avoided. A coordinated G7 framework operates differently. It creates convergence pressure across 7 of the world's largest economies simultaneously, which means the regulatory ceiling and floor for AI companies could shift faster and more uniformly than most market participants currently price in. The actionable insight here is not that regulation is coming. We have known that. The insight is that the architecture of that regulation appears to be moving from national to multinational, and that transition compresses the timeline. Companies and investors who modeled AI regulatory risk as a slow, fragmented process may need to revisit that assumption. One of the more instructive dynamics to emerge from the current regulatory environment is what happened after Anthropic, the AI safety company, formally asked Washington for regulation. According to the headlines, Washington went much further than Anthropic had requested. This is a pattern worth understanding analytically, because it has precedent. When an industry participant, particularly one with credibility on safety grounds, invites regulatory engagement, they are typically attempting to shape the terms of oversight before it arrives on its own terms. It is a calculated move. You get credit for cooperation, you get a seat in the drafting room, and you get a framework you can at least partially live with. Anthropic's public positioning on AI safety gave them standing to make that request credibly. What they appear to have received is a regulatory response that exceeded the scope of their ask. Without speculating on the specific provisions, because the headlines do not give us that detail, the structural implication is significant. Governments, once engaged on AI risk, are not simply adopting the frameworks that labs propose. They are expanding them. That is what legislatures and regulators do when they sense the political salience of an issue has reached a threshold where inaction carries its own cost. For the AI sector broadly, this creates a specific kind of uncertainty that is distinct from the uncertainty of no regulation. It is the uncertainty of open-ended regulatory ambition, where the starting point was defined by the industry, but the end point is being defined by governments whose incentives are not purely commercial. The actionable framing. If you are evaluating AI companies and you are treating regulatory risk as a binary, regulated or not regulated, you are modeling it incorrectly. The more important variable now is regulatory scope creep, and Anthropic's experience is the clearest live example of it. This is not financial advice. It is a lens for more precise analysis. While AI executives were sitting with G7 leaders, two things were happening simultaneously in Beijing that deserve equal analytical attention. China's securities regulator issued a warning against speculating on what it called tech hype, and specifically flagged using AI for stock picking. And separately, China pushed for AI safety commitments as the G7 summit concluded, notably without Beijing in the room. These two signals, read together, tell a coherent story about Chinese strategic positioning. The securities regulator warning is consistent with Beijing's recurring approach to domestic technology markets: allow development, suppress speculation, maintain control over narrative. When Chinese regulators call something tech hype, the message to domestic investors is typically to stop front-running state priorities and wait for official direction. That is not the same as skepticism about AI. It is skepticism about unsanctioned enthusiasm. The AI safety push at G7's conclusion is the more geopolitically interesting signal. China was not at the G7. That is not new. It has never been. But advocating for AI safety norms at the moment when G7 nations are clearly moving toward a coordinated framework is a specific kind of diplomatic positioning. It signals that China wants standing in whatever global governance architecture emerges, without being subordinate to a framework it had no role in designing. For anyone thinking about the AI sector through a geopolitical lens, this is the divergence trade in slow motion. The West appears to be building a coordinated multinational AI governance structure anchored by the G7. China is building a parallel track, domestic control mechanisms combined with selective engagement on international safety norms. These two tracks are not converging, they are diverging. And divergence in regulatory regimes historically creates asymmetric outcomes for companies operating across both jurisdictions. The question you should be sitting with: which AI companies have the most exposure to that divergence, and how are they currently valued relative to that risk? That is the analytical thread worth pulling. We opened with a simple observation. AI executives are now in the room where geopolitical decisions get made. What that resolves to is this: regulatory risk for AI is no longer a domestic variable. It is a multinational coordination problem, with China running a parallel track. The next question this raises, and the one we will get into next, is which specific companies are most exposed to that regulatory divergence and whether current valuations reflect it. Subscribe if that is the thread you want to follow.